This is part 2 of the human-computer interaction video, and in particular, this part concerns an activity identified as SQuaRE, which, as shown here, stands for Systems and Software Quality Requirements and Evaluation. And it's a large activity, and I'll try and give you a sense of it. Now, as a reminder, this is an activity from the ISO Joint Technical Committee 1, which is concerned with user interfaces. And in particular, to find additional information on this topic, I've shown in previous videos how to get there, but just as a reminder, go to the ISO.org website, select Taking Part, then under that select Who Develops Standards, then under that select Technical Committees, and scroll through that list of technical committees to find Joint Technical Committee 1 Information Technology, which is at the beginning of the list. Then, under Quick Links, select Work Program, and then scroll to the section on user interfaces, or you can go directly to it using this particular URL, iso.org/committee/45382, which is the specific designator for that committee, /x/catalog, British spelling, / and you'll get there. So either way. ISO Joint Technical Committee number 1, Information Technology, has developed literally 3,180 standards, so they've been extremely active. That committee is concerned with things like MPEG, smart cards, databases, programming languages, all kinds of issues related to information technology. Here's a list of all the subcommittees that are of interest to this particular topic area, or in particular this committee. 2 of them are specifically of interest. One is Subcommittee 7, which is Software and Systems Engineering, and the second is Subcommittee 35, which has produced 85 standards, which is User Interfaces. And surprisingly, although this one sounds like it's less important, in fact, activities related to the topic, human-computer interaction standards, are covered by both committees, and I'll talk about, in particular, some of the activities under SC7 in this video. But to give you a sense of the range of topics developed by this Joint Technical Committee overall, here are some of the topics they've dealt with. So there's IEC 9995, which is keyboard layouts. It has many, many parts for the different kinds of layouts that exist. ISO 10741-1, cursor control. So if you're using cursors in text editing, it gives you a sense of what it's about. ISO 11581, which is icons. Icons is obviously a big topic covered in many places. And there are standards associated with assistive technology, with pen gestures, with menu navigations, with universal remote consoles, such as like those used for televisions, and obviously for voice commands. And so I want to emphasize that the activities this committee have done are rather vast, and all I'm doing here is kind of touching upon one small piece of the work that they do. Now, to put all of this in perspective, Subcommittee 7 has developed sort of a framework of topics that are related to systems engineering and software, and the sort of summary of this material appears in a document called ISO 25010, and it's not a specific user interface document. It's more a kind of a general document that covers the overall issue of developing good software. And so there are sort of 8 topics, I've called them the 8 pillars, that are in that document. So there are issues about functional suitability, and here's some of the topics. There's performance efficiency, a list of topics. Compatibility, a list of topics. Usability, which is obviously of great interest to us, and a list of several topics. Appropriateness, recognizability, learnability, operability, user error protection, user interface aesthetics, and accessibility. These are all major issues. And then other topics are reliability, security, maintainability, and portability. So this is basically the framework for thinking about system and software engineering. And I also want to highlight that there are related materials in ISO 9126. So with that, I want to focus on a subset of the documents that are relevant, in particular those, there's the so-called ISO 2500 series. And they are partitioned into 6 categories, one having to do with requirements. And I should note that sort of 2500 is the main number. And so you can see quality requirements are 2503 and some number, in theory 0 through 9, that could be after that, that represent various standards in that topic. So there's quality requirements, quality models, quality management, quality measurement, and quality evaluation. And sort of all these are in that particular numeric range. So the way people think about usability is through the lens of quality. Is the software of high quality or not? Right. So to support that, they've come up with a series of documents, and they start with sort of the framework is based on material in ISO 9241-210, which is called the Ergonomics of Human System Interaction, and also 15288, which is more general in its sense that it concerns life cycle processes. And sort of the framework of how everything fits together is shown here. So in the center of all activity is thinking about user needs. And related to that are 4 topics: context of use, derived requirements, design solutions, and evaluation. And so as shown in this figure, the coverage of context of use has overlap with user needs, but also design requirements. And so therefore, one needs to make sure that in looking at these documents, you need to realize that they're highly interrelated. And you'll see some parts in various documents that sound alike. So let me examine these one at a time to sort of talk about the overall framework and the particular documents that are associated with them. And then I'll kind of, after going through this entire framework in a little bit greater detail, then talk about each specific document and its relevance. All right, so here's the context of use. I guess if you think of this as a flower, the petal enlarged. And so the kind of general software quality documents is ISO 15288, various parts. But the documents of interest to us are these two, ISO 25063 and 25064, which is context of use and user needs. So these are all related to the topic of context of use. And so again, that's sort of this part of the framework. Then second, on the right-hand side, derived requirements, again, is this high-level ISO document that has to do with quality, and specifically ISO 25065, which is user requirements. Then at the bottom of the petal, we're interested in design solutions shown here. So again, the high-level ISO document, that's at the quality level document, and then the 2 specific documents we're interested in, which have to do with user interaction and user interface specification. And as shown by the X, these documents are still not completed at this point in time, if my memory is correct. And then finally, the 4th piece of this is evaluation. And so we have the high-level ISO quality documents, and then the specific documents that are associated with this particular topic area of user interfaces. So the common industry format for usability test reports, 25066, the evaluation document, 25064, and also the field data report. This one is yet to be completed. So as sort of a framework for all of this is this common industry format for usability, which is trying to give some sense of how things are to be specified for the user interface. This is not in an ISO standard, but rather in a technical report, 25060. And of course, when you look at these, the lower the number, the more it is towards a sort of fundamental overview, and the less it's a detailed specification. So this document was completed in 2010. It's 30 pages long and has 21 references. So let me show you the table of contents to give you a sense of what it's like. So again, this is kind of starting out. This is the overview that frames all the reports that follow, hence the idea of a framework. So what I've done in this particular image and in all the images that follow is tried to cut out some of the things that are pretty standard or pro forma so that it will be easier to read the material that's remaining. So the scope, the introduction, and so forth have been removed. All of these documents have terms and definitions in them, but I thought it would be helpful to provide it anyway as a reminder. So here are the topics that are covered, and so you can see kind of a general overview in the third section. Going back again to another ISO document, 9241-210, and then talking about, in some sense, the petals of that flower. So context of use, user needs, user requirements, user interaction, user interface, evaluation, and field data report. Also, it has an appendix, and most of these are fairly useful. The annexes often contain more useful information than the body of the document. Again, this is 31 pages, so the coverage of these sections is fairly brief. And this is more of kind of an introduction to what the sequence is about, rather than containing any real details. Those details appear in the documents that follow. So here's the sort of the description of the process, and I want to focus on this particular sentence. In order to enable human-centered design to be adopted, it is important that all relevant usability information are identified and documented. And that's really the focus of this sequence of standards, to assist in the documentation of the process. And it's not merely documentation for documentation's sake, but rather it really gives you a sense of exactly how to carry out these processes to make sure they're complete and thorough. So I also want to highlight in the beginning of it, there are a number of terms in there that are defined, and some of these terms may or may not appear elsewhere. They sound pretty simple in terms of what they are, but as you go to carry out some evaluation, so for example, you say, well, this is a user interface question. Well, what really is formally defined as the user interface? Not what you think it is, but what everybody has agreed upon. And you'll find that following these definitions and citing them are really helpful in avoiding arguments in the interface development and evaluation process. So these are sort of the common terms. They seem simple, but in fact, it's worth looking at their definitions. So what I want to do is focus on the first document in this series, ISO 25062. You can see by these numbers, these are a little more substantial. It was first released in 2006. It's got 54 pages, so we're now talking about far more content. 11 references, which is somewhat on a smaller number. So this is really about what should be in a usability test report. And NIST was extremely influential in creating this. You can get this online, the current version. However, if you go to the NIST site, you'll see a number of earlier versions of that particular document. And they're actually, especially the second version, is actually fairly close to what the final version is. So I want to emphasize both. I've said this at the end of we'll say this at the end of the video and in several places on these videos, that this particular presentation does give a summary of what's in these documents. But if you're asked to carry out activities related to them, the summary here just gives you a sense of what's there. You really need to buy the document and read it yourself and very carefully to make sure that you comply with all the requirements. So this is more of something beyond a teaser to get you interested in looking at these documents and give you a sense of what's relevant to what you're doing and not relevant. So this is actually one of the first documents that came out, and it's extremely useful. So let me show you the table of contents, which looks like this. So again, you have terms and definitions and the various things that are in there. Title page, what should be on the executive summary, and all the other sections. And then what's extremely useful in this document is a checklist that allows you to go through a report and say, have I done this? Have I done that? Is anything missing? Let me give you a sense of some of the sections in that document. And so here's an example of a checklist. And what must the title page have? Well, the company name, an identifier that it's in the CIF format, the product name, who led the test, dates, reports, authors, company name, supplier name, and so forth. I mean, this seems pretty obvious, but it's useful to make sure that you follow precisely what's listed. And in fact, just to give you a sense, this is what Section 5.1 deals with. So it seems obvious, but as you'll see, it's very easy to forget to include something. And complying with a standard practice is very helpful when somebody said, I don't think you did it appropriately, or they challenge what you did. knowing that you followed a standard of accepted procedure is really very helpful. Here's what the executive summary must have: an overview of the test, the product name, the method, but some details like the types of subjects and tasks, statistics including measures of central tendency, the reason for the task. They actually want tables, not just words. Most executive summaries are 1 or 2 pages long of words only. In this case, they're saying, no, you need tables or figures. And obviously, they're also looking for statistics, the probability of differences if there are any there. In addition, there's more information about the introduction. Things like the product evaluated, the users, assistive technologies, why was the test conducted, the objectives, functional components, reason for the focus, and again, this is 5.3. And all I'm doing here is giving you a short listing of what's in there. There's actually a lot more there in the way of requirements, and this is just the introduction to the particular test report. You have to have a method section, and they're looking for all kinds of details. Here's an example of a table that they suggest you provide, which indicates P means participants. So for each participant, age, gender, education, occupation, computer experience, products experience, how the subjects were selected, the differences between the sample and the user population. So they really are looking for considerable detail to help people assess what's in the test report. These things are commonly provided, but not always. And again, especially for people who are newer to the field, knowing what is expected is very helpful. So this is an extremely useful, detailed document. Then there's information about the context of use. So what was tested, and what tasks were performed, and what were the test scenarios, and why were these tasks selected, and what was relevant to them, and how did we know a person was done with a task? What were the criteria? So we tend to think of all these things, but again, having these kinds of details listed makes sure that your report isn't missing information that otherwise should be provided. Experiment design. So they're looking for all kinds of details. And they call this, they talk about the procedure section. So what were operational definitions of the measures? We measured the time to completion of this task. When would timing start, and how do you know something was complete? What were the independent and control variables? How long did people have to do the tasks, or was it open-ended? How did you interact with subjects? What were the instructions like? And on and on and on. Even some things like details of the NDA, the non-disclosure agreement. Was there something that you're not allowed to disclose? Kind of give a sense of what that is, because that might affect what's in the report. And so all sorts of detail, things like how were subjects compensated? Were they paid? Were they volunteers? If they were paid, how much? All of this does reflect upon the data that was collected and interpretation of it. Then ISO, this uses some ideas from ISO 9241. They use the word metric. I tend not to like the word metric because it's ambiguous as to whether they mean a statistic or a measure or a collection of measures or a collection of statistics. It's a term that could mean any one of the three. In the context of this particular work, they divide the things that you measure into 3 broad categories, which they call effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. And here's where they're defined. And it's important to keep, this may not be the only way to do it, but it's important to keep it in mind because this is the way this sequence of documents works. So effectiveness is achieving accuracy and completeness. And here are some measures that are appropriate for that. Efficiency is a different measure. It's effectiveness, but relative to resources expended. And the last piece is satisfaction, which is how the user thinks about the product. And I've listed an alphabet soup of measures: ASQ, CUSI, PSSUQ, QUIS, SUMI, and SUS, which are some of the many subjective measures that are used to assess the user's satisfaction with a particular product. You'll find a great deal of information online about these. But what they have done is at least identified some of the ones that are out there currently, and there are probably many more that will occur in the future. So in terms of this ISO procedure, they look at effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. And then what you need to do is think about what measures are appropriate for that. You may wish to depart and measure other things. That's certainly your prerogative. What's in the results section? And so typically, they recommend a table something like the following: to list the participants, to provide summary statistics for each measure that's examined. And I think in this case, the ISO document talks about the word measure, but I think that's probably appropriate in this case. And what I've tried to do in all these slides is indicate the section number in which the material on this topic is found, should you wish to go one step further and actually focus on it fairly quickly. The next document I want to mention is ISO 25063, and so this is the context of use description. This document was written somewhat later, 2014, 34 pages, and it has more references than the previous document. Here's the table of contents of that document, and again, I've removed some of the front-end material, so I try to always start with terms and definitions, so you can see the purposes that are there. But the bulk of the document is section 5, which is the description of the elements of context of use. And then again, this particular document has some annexes, some appendices, which are extremely informative. All right, so what is context of use? Here's the definition. It's definition 3.2 in that document. It has to do with users, tasks, and equipment, and the physical and social environments in which a system, product, or service is used. So as you think about what's in this document, this definition provides the description of what it should do. And then there's some other things that are kind of important for the context of use, in particular personas. There's a lot written on personas. I would strongly urge you, if you're developing a user interface of some type, to take the time to develop personas. They're really very helpful in making design decisions. For those of you that are unfamiliar with it, it's the representation of a user that contains a concise summary of their characteristics that helps make design. So you might have, somebody, for example, if you're designing a vehicle, you might have, okay, we have an elderly truck driver, and here's how much they drive and where they drive, and here's like their hobbies, and here's how many hours they work per week, and here's the kinds of roads they drive on, and other kinds of things, what they like and don't like about their job. These kinds of things help you make design decisions for the user interface. ISO 25063 also gives a fair amount of information on examples of the context of use of information. And here's an example of a section. This is section 5.3, and they talk about these 4 formats, which are an initial outline, a detailed description, what appears in an evaluation report, and what appears in a product description. And there are a number of specific items, and these tables say what should appear, what shall appear, and so forth. So in terms of thinking about which information items are required or desired, ISO 25063 is very helpful for that purpose. Here's another example. I haven't listed what section or which type of document, which variant of the document each item is required, but I did want to give you a sense of what kinds of information is desired in terms of describing user groups. So identify them all, a separate description of each distinctively different group of the system, product, or service. So include all the user groups and describe them in detail. Identify other stakeholders who could have an impact on the system of the system, product, or service. So these are things to consider in providing a context of use report, and what's required for which format of report you can get from looking at the document. There's no way I could provide all that information here. I could spend the better part of an hour just on this one document. The goals. What are the goals of the user and their task? So different user groups might have different things they're trying to accomplish. So think about what the goals are and elaborate them on in great detail. That's actually very important in figuring out how to design something, because the user wants to do something. The question is, how do they do it? Tasks. A task is what each user does to achieve their goals. So what are the tasks and what are their attributes? And here's a rather shortened list of all the kinds of attributes that a task might have. Its goal, its outcome, its frequency and importance, its input variability, information needs, complexity, dependencies, what's done serially or parallel, task load. All these things affect the completion of a task. And so the context of use report asks for you to provide these kinds of details so that when you go to assess a task, you can do it appropriately. There's a whole section there on the environment and the technology environment in which a task is performed. So here's some of the things that you ordinarily think of, but you may not think of everything in this list. So what hardware is used, what screen is used, what kind of input devices, are you using a browser, an operating system, what version? When you go to look at, for example, use of the web, browsers are changing continually, so you have to test different versions. And if you look at the frequency of use, people are using a wide variety of browsers, not just Google Chrome. Connectivity, obviously hardware tends to be faster than wireless. Assistive technology, some tasks require to wear personal protective equipment, so you need to do that. And then finally, the environment also has physical and social elements to it. Just given space, I've not identified them here. Section 5.7 talks about including trouble reports. So what kinds of things do we know historically that are problems? And let's make sure in the context of use report that they're included. I think one of the most useful parts of the context of use report that I found was the checklist in the annex. And what I provided here is an example of one item. So this is example 1.1.1. So decide whether different user types need to be identified. If the user population contains groups of people who perform different sets of tasks, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a really nice example that's shown here to talk about people with disabilities versus able-bodied users and how tasks are performed. So I found that this particular annex is, as I've mentioned, is really quite useful. So if you're creating a context of use report, you not only want to know what the shoulds and shalls are from the body of the document, but then seeing how it's implemented really helps you be very efficient in writing your report. Next document I want to talk about is ISO 25064, which is the user needs report. This is 2013, so it's one of the things that came along a little later. 32 pages long, 16 references, fairly useful. What I want to start out with is by saying, well, what is a user need? And that's a definition that's in the document and described here. It's a prerequisite identified as necessary for a user or a set of users to achieve an intended outcome, implied or stated, within a specific context of use. And context of use was defined earlier. And this is really to kind of help everybody get on the same page, to help the team work together to identify requirements. And then once the system or service or product is developed, to be able to audit to make sure that all the requirements were met. All right. Again, here's the table of contents from a user needs report. So there's a lot of kind of introductory general material about when they're needed and for what purpose. And then there's the specific content of a report. And these are the major sections of that which are described, which I'll talk about in some detail. So the elements, the indicators of need, what the user needs to do, where the data came from, and other topic, data collection, and finally supporting information. And again, as with several other documents in this series, the annexes are useful because they tend to provide details that are not covered in the body. In this case, formats. All right, so what does a user needs statement need to include? Who the users are, what they're trying to do, what they need to do, and the context of use document, which was described earlier. And so here's an example of a simple user needs statement. An employee needs to know how to obtain an access coded to log on to their work computer using tax software. There's a simple example. So thinking very explicitly about user needs helps one design the task and the interface. Now, another document I want to mention in this series is 26065, which is currently under development, which is the user's requirements specification. So the requirements comes from the needs, and it's under development. The intent is it's going to be about 24 pages long. We will see how it goes. Next is ISO 25066, which is the evaluation report. And again, it's having to do with this common industry format. This document is somewhat newer, 2016, 46 pages, so a fair amount of comment and 19 references. So here's the table of contents. Again, I've eliminated certain things up front before the definition section. And what's in front sometimes is a scope, sometimes is an introduction, sometimes there might be rationale. So the section numbering is not always the same across documents, just because different standards have different front matter. So purposes and types, this is fairly brief. And then the details of what is in a usability evaluation report. The structure is pretty much what you'd expect from a report: a summary, the purpose, the methods, the procedure. And it's interesting they use the terms method and procedure as being equal rather than procedure part of method. Results, interpretation, which is really important, and then kind of additional information to provide context. And again, some very informative appendices, which in ISO terminology are called annexes. So I want to emphasize a few definitions because they do have impact. They do indicate the kinds of things they're interested in when talking about evaluation. So there's this concept of inspection evaluation, where you simply examine the system for potential usability problems, their walkthroughs, and various other kinds of things. Another term that's fairly important is a usability defect. Defect has particular meaning, and if you say something's a usability defect, you don't want to use that term lightly. So here's the definition. It's lead to a mismatch between intentions and actions and the system attributes and behavior. So defect has a particular meaning in physical products. It also has a meaning for usability. A usability finding, that's another term which actually you want to use formally and correctly. And what's a use error? Again, another term you want to make sure you use correctly. There are many other terms in these documents, so as you use as you do usability work, please make sure that you use the terms in the way that they're officially defined. You may have a different definition for them. That's quite okay to do, but just make sure that the definition that you identify or that you use should be identified as being a deviation for what ISO says is the accepted definition. So what's in a usability evaluation report? There's several types, and so you can have inspections, which I talked about earlier, observations of users in real settings, and finally surveys. So these are the sort of three basic types of methods that they focus on. And then, as with some of the other documents, what are the specific things you want in a report? And so they talk about, again, as I mentioned, inspections, different kinds of observations, 2 classes, and user surveys. And then here are all the things that you could measure: intended context of use, prior summaries. And notice that some things are shall and some things are should. And so this is sort of their prescription of when you need to provide some information and when it's somewhat optional. All right. So what's the purpose of an evaluation report? What should be in it? Well, you need to say what the user requirements are. So the key thing is that all these documents are tied together. And so you create a user requirements document. So when you do the evaluation should be based upon the requirements that need to be satisfied. What are the usability defects? And again, that term was defined earlier. What are the benchmarks? What are the methods you used, and what are the standards against which an interface is assessed? And remember, I talked about usability and the 3 core characteristics being effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. What are the pass-fail criteria? And other purposes that these documents might be needing to satisfy. And again, what I've always tried to do in this survey is always say what section in these documents contains this information, should you wish to follow up. All right, the method section. What's in the method section? So the kind of evaluation, and here's this kind of an interesting common bottom line. You always need to include enough information so that somebody else can replicate what you did within the limits of statistical accuracy. How many subjects? Were they in groups? What are their characteristics? What tasks were used? And so forth. So this is an evaluation report. What should be in it, in particular, in the methods section. Then there's the procedure section, which describes more specifically how things were done. What were the independent variables? Were there any dependent measures? What were the operational definitions of the measures and criteria? So often we'll give a term, but we don't say precisely what that term means. And so what you want to do is make sure you give a very precise definition. So for example, for driving, you might wish to look at SAE recommended practice J2944. And so instructions to participants, you want to make sure that you've included them so that somebody else can, again, duplicate what you did within the limits of statistical error. Results. What should be in the results section of an evaluation report? Time on task, efficiency measures, task completion rates, errors, number of assists. That's kind of an interesting one that people don't think about, that when you're performing a usability test, that sometimes users are struggling, they encounter a problem, and you reach a point where they're not going to make any further progress. So in that case, you say something like, press this button and allow them to move on. It's generally not advisable to explain why, just to explain what to do. Because if they get stuck on that one problem, then you don't find out about other problems, and that's really informative. So if that occurs, then you need to say how many assists were required, because the greater number of assists, the more it suggests there are problems with the interface. So I hope that's given you a reasonable sense of this series of documents. I'd like to thank the National Institute of Standards and Technology for supporting this work. I've got a more detailed explanation of my thanks to NIST that's shown on the slide. In addition, I'd like to thank Michigan Nexus from the College of Engineering for helping to produce these videos. They're intended to be a supplement to the Human Factors Engineering short course, which is taught last week in July, first week of August each year. If you'd like to find out more about that course, you can Google University of Michigan Human Factors Engineering short course or Center for Ergonomics, and any one of those two sequences of text or others should get you to the short course. Finally, I want to emphasize that if you need to apply the standards in these videos, that you really need to get the originals. Yes, I provide a summary of what's in there, but if you're going to apply them, you really need all the details, and there's simply no time in this particular presentation to include them. So I want to urge you to get the originals, and finally, you should realize that over time they could change, and although this video reflects the documents as of now, that in the future they're going to evolve, and the requirements may change, and so you need to really make sure that you use the latest documents. Thank you.